The human girl hated the cold vampire king until an assassin ambush trapped them in the forest. "Don't move," Jacob hissed, his voice barely a rasp over the howling wind. His hand, as cold as the snow beneath them, clamped over Isabella's mouth. Above the ridge, the crackle of tactical radios cut through the dark. Sweeping beams of UV lasers sliced the fog, searching for them. Isabella trembled, not just from the freezing mud seeping through her torn dress, but from the terrifying proximity of the vampire king. His blood dripped onto her cheek, thick, black, and completely wrong. He was dying. "They have silver nitrate rounds," she whispered frantically against his frozen fingers when the lights passed. "You need to leave me." Jacob's crimson eyes locked onto hers, burning with an emotion she had never seen in him. "I would burn this forest to ash before I let them touch you." The interior of the armored Maybach was a masterclass in suffocating silence. Isabella sat pressed against the furthest edge of the leather seat, staring out the reinforced, heavily tinted window. The world outside was a blur of towering black pines and relentless, driving sleet as they navigated the treacherous mountain pass toward the summit. She traced the condensation on the glass, deliberately avoiding the reflection of the man sitting opposite her. Jacob. The vampire king. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the estate 3 hours ago. He sat perfectly still, a tablet resting on his knees, his sharp, aristocratic features illuminated only by the pale blue glow of the screen. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, immaculate and intimidating. Everything about him was sharp, his jawline, his posture, his unyielding, predatory stillness. The ambient light caught the faint, silver signet ring on his right hand, the crest of the Night Court, a symbol that haunted Isabella's nightmares. Isabella pulled her cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders, shivering. It wasn't just the ambient temperature of the car, which was kept notoriously low. It was the absolute void of warmth radiating from him. The air around him felt physically heavier, laced with an ancient, terrifying authority. "Turn the heat up," she said, her voice sounding entirely too loud in the quiet cabin. Jacob didn't look up from his tablet. He merely tapped a long, pale finger against the armrest console. A faint click echoed, and a subtle breath of warmer air began to filter through the vents. "Thank you," she muttered, laced with bitter sarcasm. "Your discomfort is noted, Isabella," Jacob replied. His voice was a rich, dark velvet, but utterly devoid of inflection. However, bringing human physiology up to optimal temperature too quickly in this altitude can cause lethargy. "We arrive at the summit in 40 minutes. You need to be alert." Isabella gritted her teeth. Always a calculation, always a strategy. She was nothing more than a political prop to him. 3 months ago, the human enclaves had negotiated a fragile ceasefire with the Night Court. The cost? A human liaison to live within the king's walls, a hostage dressed in silk. She had been ripped from her family, her home, and thrust into a world of eternal night and predatory politics. "I am perfectly alert," she countered, turning her head to finally look at him. "It's hard to be lethargic when I'm constantly wondering if your inner circle is going to drain me the moment the treaty negotiations hit a snag." Jacob's finger paused on the screen. He slowly raised his head. His eyes were a mesmerizing, terrifying shade of deep crimson. They didn't blink. They just categorized her, dissecting her anger, her fear, her defiance. "If my inner circle intended to harm you," he said softly, "you would not have made it to the car. My guards are disciplined. They do not act without my explicit command. Comforting, it is a statement of fact." Jacob set the tablet down. "You let your emotions dictate your logic. It is a human flaw, but one you must suppress tonight. The other faction leaders will smell your resentment. They will use it to wedge the treaty apart. They thrive on perceived weakness, and right now, Your pulse is broadcasting terror like a beacon. Maybe I want it wedged apart, she snapped, the frustration of the past 3 months boiling over. Maybe I'm tired of living in a palace that feels like a mausoleum. You don't feel anything, Jacob. You don't laugh, you don't mourn, you just exist. You're cold. Everything about you is just ice. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his crimson eyes. A shadow, a microscopic tightening of his jaw, but it was gone before she could even be sure she saw it. My temperature, he said, his tone dropping an octave, is exactly what keeps you alive. Isabella opened her mouth to argue, but the words never came. A deafening roar shattered the night. The heavy SUV was suddenly lifted off the ground, a massive kinetic force slamming into the passenger side. The world spun into a chaotic blender of shrieking metal, shattering glass, and blinding light. Gravity inverted. Isabella screamed as her body was thrown violently against the seatbelt, the airbags deploying with a concussive blast that knocked the breath from her lungs. The Maybach rolled over the icy asphalt once, twice, tearing through the reinforced steel guardrail before plunging into the black abyss of the forest below. During the terrifying freefall, Isabella felt a hand, strong, unyielding, and impossibly cold, grip her arm, anchoring her to the seat as the darkness rushed up to swallow them. The smell of ozone and pine needles burned Isabella's throat. She gasped, her eyes snapping open to a nightmare of twisted metal and flashing hazard lights. She was hanging upside down, suspended by her seatbelt. Blood dripped from a cut on her forehead, pooling in her eyelashes. The silence was absolute, save for the hiss of the ruptured radiator and the groan of settling steel. "Jacob!" she choked out, panic seizing her chest. "Do not speak!" The voice came from the darkness directly below her. A metallic groan echoed through the cabin as Jacob shoved the crushed roof of the SUV upward, creating enough space to move. In the dim, flickering light, Isabella saw him. His immaculate suit was ruined, covered in glass dust and mud. But it wasn't the dirt that made her breath catch. A jagged piece of the door frame was embedded deep in his shoulder. He didn't even seem to notice it. He reached up, his movements fluid and unnervingly calm, and sliced her seatbelt with a shard of broken glass. He caught her effortlessly as she fell, cradling her against his chest before setting her down on the slanted ceiling of the overturned car. His touch, despite the chaos, was startlingly gentle. "Are you broken?" he asked, his crimson eyes scanning her body with terrifying speed. I don't think so," Isabella stammered, touching her forehead. "My head hurts." "What happened? Did we hit ice?" "We were hit by an RPG." Jacob's hand shot out, gripping the mangled door handle. He tore the reinforced steel door off its hinges with a sickening crack, tossing it out into the snow as if it weighed nothing. "Move. Now." He dragged her out of the wreckage into the biting, freezing wind. The snow was already calf-deep. Above them, up the steep embankment they had rolled down, the distant glow of burning debris illuminated the road. Suddenly, a blinding white light swept through the trees from the road above. "Thermal scopes," Jacob whispered, shoving Isabella hard against the trunk of a massive oak tree. He pressed his body flush against hers, shielding her completely from the embankment. His body felt like a block of solid marble, immovable and dense. "Who are they?" she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Assassins. Human mercenaries. Likely hired by the separatist vampire factions who oppose the treaty." Jacob looked down at her. "They know I am in this vehicle. They know you are with me." A series of sharp, suppressed thwips echoed through the woods. The bark of the oak tree inches from Isabella's face exploded into splinters. She screamed, but Jacob's hand was instantly over her mouth. "Run!" he commanded, his eyes flashing with a violent, protective fury. "Straight into the tree line. Do not look back." "I can't. Run, Isabella." He shoved her toward the dense thicket, turning back toward the embankment, just as 3 figures in white winter tactical gear rappelled down the slope. They held heavy, matte black rifles. Isabella stumbled through the deep snow, her boots slipping on the ice. She looked back over her shoulder, just in time to see Jacob move. He didn't run. He vanished. 1 second he was standing by the smoking wreck. The next, he was a blur of violence. He slammed into the first mercenary, the impact echoing like a thunderclap. The man's rifle fired wildly into the air before he was thrown 30 feet into the darkness, his body cracking against a boulder. But these weren't ordinary thugs. The second and third mercenaries adjusted instantly. The muzzle flashes from their rifles were bright blue. UV rounds. Isabella's stomach plummeted. And silver. Jacob dodged the spray of light, moving with a supernatural grace, but in the tight confines of the crash site, there was nowhere to maneuver. He lunged for the second shooter, tearing the rifle from his hands, but the third mercenary dropped to a knee and fired point blank into Jacob's chest. A choked, guttural roar ripped from the Vampire King's throat. He stumbled backward, clutching his side. "Jacob!" Isabella screamed, abandoning her flight and taking a step back toward him. "Go!" he roared, backhanding the third mercenary with enough force to shatter the man's tactical helmet. Jacob didn't finish them off. He grabbed the dropped rifle, crushed it beneath his heel, and sprinted toward Isabella. He caught her around the waist, lifting her off her feet, and plunged them both into the absolute darkness of the freezing, ancient forest. Behind them, the shouts of reinforcements echoed down the embankment. The hunt had begun. They ran for what felt like hours, though Isabella's perception of time had dissolved into a haze of exhaustion and terror. Jacob didn't set her down. He carried her over fallen redwood trunks, through frozen streams, and up impossibly steep, rocky inclines. His speed was terrifying, but his breathing, which usually didn't exist, was becoming erratic. Every few minutes he would stumble, his grip on her tightening to the point of bruising before he righted himself. The cold was absolute. The forest canopy was so thick that the moonlight couldn't penetrate, leaving them in pitch blackness. Isabella's silk dress and thin cashmere shawl were practically useless against the sub-zero temperatures. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Finally, Jacob collapsed. They spilled into a shallow, rocky outcropping, hidden beneath the roots of a giant, ancient pine. Isabella hit the frozen dirt hard, but scrambled backward, her eyes adjusting to the faint, bioluminescent glow of the forest moss. Jacob lay on his back, his chest heaving. His charcoal suit coat was soaked, but the liquid spreading across his white dress shirt wasn't red. It was thick, viscous, and black like crude oil. "Jacob!" Isabella crawled toward him, her fear of the man entirely eclipsed by the horror of the moment. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Silver nitrate," he rasped, his eyes closed. "Mixed with dead blood ash, it stops the cellular regeneration. It's burning through the vascular tissue." Isabella knelt beside him. Up close, the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had caught him just below the ribs. For a vampire, a gunshot was usually an annoyance. This was tearing him apart from the inside, the silver reacting violently with his immortal biology. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice cracking. "How do I fix it?" "You don't." His crimson eyes fluttered open, locking on to her. They were dimmer now, the predatory fire fading into something startlingly human. Exhaustion. "You wait here. They cannot track my thermal signature. I don't produce heat. By morning, they will assume I dragged you out of the zone. You can hike south toward the valley. There is a human settlement 12 miles from here." "I am not leaving you here to die," she shot back, anger flaring through her shivering body. "I am already dead, Isabella," he said flatly. "You know what I mean." She reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before pressing her trembling hands over the wound. The moment her skin touched the black blood, Jacob flinched violently, a hiss escaping his teeth. "Don't!" he commanded, trying to push her hands away, but he was incredibly weak. "Stop fighting me," she ordered. Tearing the cashmere shawl from her shoulders, she balled it up and pressed it hard against the entry wound. "You said my emotions dictate my logic. Well, my logic says if the Vampire King dies in the woods with me, the Night Court will slaughter my entire city in retaliation. So you are going to live." A harsh, breathy sound escaped his lips. It took Isabella a second to realize it was a laugh, a dry, humorless laugh. "Always the diplomat," he whispered. Silence settled over the hollow, save for the howling wind outside their small refuge. The temperature was dropping fast. Isabella's hands were going numb, pressing against his side. She could feel the violent trembling in her own core. Hypothermia was setting in. Jacob turned his head slowly, his dim crimson eyes scanning her pale face, her blue lips, the uncontrollable shaking of her shoulders. Slowly, agonizingly, he reached up with his uninjured arm and unbuttoned his ruined suit jacket. "Take it," he ordered. "No, you're bleeding out." "Vampires do not die of the cold, Isabella. Humans do." His voice left no room for argument. "Take the coat." She reluctantly let go of the compress with one hand, sliding the heavy, blood-stained jacket off his shoulders. She wrapped it around herself. It was freezing, holding none of the body heat a human's coat would possess, but the heavy wool blocked the biting wind. She huddled back down beside him, reapplying pressure to the wound. Jacob watched her in the dark. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. "You think I am cold?" he said quietly, his voice barely a murmur over the wind. Isabella looked down at him. "I didn't mean to say those things in the car. I was angry." "You were accurate," Jacob replied. He closed his eyes. "To lead a court of monsters, you must become the void. Emotion is a vulnerability. Compassion is an invitation to be overthrown. I do not feel joy because joy can be leveraged. I do not feel warmth because warmth attracts those who wish to snuff it out." He opened his eyes, looking directly into hers. The icy facade was cracked, broken by the silver burning in his veins. "But keeping you at a distance, being cold to you," he swallowed hard. "That was not a political strategy, Isabella. That was preservation." Isabella's breath hitched. "Preservation of what?" "Of my sanity." Jacob's hand weakly rose from the dirt, his frozen fingers lightly brushing against the back of her trembling, blood-stained hand. "Because if I allowed myself to feel the warmth you bring into my palace, I would burn the world down to keep it." Isabella stared at him, the weight of his words crashing over her harder than the crash itself. The monster she had hated, the king she had feared. He hadn't been indifferent. He had been terrified. A twig snapped loudly outside the hollow. Jacob's hand instantly grabbed her wrist, his dim eyes flaring with sudden, violent alarm. The hunters had found them. The harsh, blinding beam of a tactical flashlight swept over the snow just outside the roots of the ancient pine. Heavy boots crunched rhythmically against the ice. Isabella held her breath, her heart slamming against her ribs, so violently she was certain the mercenary could hear it. The hunter was a mere 3 feet away, peering into the shadows of their shallow sanctuary. A radio on the man's shoulder hissed with static. "Echo 4, any thermal spikes in grid 7? "Negative," the mercenary whispered back. "Just a bunch of frozen dirt, still sweeping." The beam drifted closer to the hollow. In 2 seconds, it would sweep over Isabella's pale, trembling legs. Jacob didn't hesitate. He was dying, poisoned by silver and ash, his vampiric strength severely compromised. But he was still the king. He didn't move as a blur. He lunged with a raw, brutal, animalistic desperation. His hand shot out of the darkness, gripping the mercenary's armored ankle with the force of a hydraulic press. The man barely had time to gasp before Jacob yanked him violently into the hollow. The mercenary's chin slammed against a jagged rock, shattering bone, but he still managed to raise his rifle. Before he could pull the trigger, Jacob's free hand closed over his throat. With a sickening, wet crunch, the struggle ended as quickly as it had begun. Jacob collapsed instantly beside the dead man, a terrifying wet cough tearing through his chest. A fresh wave of thick black blood spilled from his wound, soaking into the frost. Isabella scrambled backward in horror, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The hollow smelled intensely of iron and death. We cannot stay here," Jacob wheezed, his eyes rolling back. "He missed his check-in. They will swarm." Isabella forced herself to look away from the dead man and back to Jacob. He was right. She crawled forward, adrenaline completely overriding her hypothermia. She ignored the gore, stripping the dead mercenary of his heavy, insulated white parka, his tactical backpack, and his sidearm. She threw the oversized parka over her own shoulders, instantly feeling the trapped, blessed warmth of the down insulation. Next, she dug through the man's pack, her frozen fingers clumsy as she found a heavy-duty climbing rope and a GPS device with a cracked screen. A tiny green blip pulsed a quarter-mile away. It was marked, "Old Logging Shelter." "I'm getting us out of here," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Leave me." Jacob's voice was a whisper now. His skin was turning the color of ash. "I am anchor weight." "Shut up," she snapped, wrapping his ruined suit jacket tighter around him. She took the dead man's rifle strap, looping it under Jacob's arms, and tied the other end around her waist. It was a makeshift harness, brutal and primitive, but it was all she had. "I'm going to pull," she told him, tears of strain blurring her vision. "Try to push with your legs." She crawled out of the hollow into the biting wind, leaning forward with every ounce of her strength. For a terrifying second, the dead weight behind her didn't budge. Then, Jacob dug his heels into the frozen dirt, aiding her just enough to slide out of the roots. The next 40 minutes were an agonizing blur of pain and exertion. Isabella dragged the Vampire King through the snow-choked forest, her muscles screaming, her breath tearing through her throat like broken glass. Every shadow looked like an assassin. Every gust of wind sounded like a silencer firing. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Finally, breaking through a dense thicket of white birches, she saw it. A dilapidated, rotting wooden cabin leaning heavily against the side of the mountain. The door of the logging shelter was kicked off its hinges, snow drifting onto the rotted floorboards. It was little more than a box to block the wind, but in the center of the room sat a rusted iron wood stove. Isabella dragged Jacob inside, unhooking the harness and letting him collapse onto a pile of moldy burlap sacks. He was completely unresponsive now, his breathing shallow and rattling. Working with frantic speed, she pulled emergency road flares and a dry block of kindling from the mercenary's pack. Within minutes, a small, smoky fire was crackling inside the stove. The ambient temperature of the small room began to rise just enough to stave off frostbite. She knelt beside Jacob. The black veins radiating from his gunshot wound had crept up his chest, sprawling toward his neck like a terrifying spiderweb. "Jacob," she said, shaking his good shoulder. "Jacob, look at me." His eyelids fluttered. The crimson glow in his irises was almost entirely extinguished, replaced by a dull, milky pink. "The bullet," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "It is lodged near the spine. The silver is necrotizing my heart." Isabella stared at the ragged hole in his side. She was no medic, but she understood the physics of poison. "I have to take it out." "You cannot." "I have a knife," she said, pulling the dead mercenary's combat blade from its sheath. She walked over to the wood stove, resting the flat of the blade against the iron until the metal began to smoke. When she returned to his side, Jacob was watching her. The absolute terror in his dim eyes wasn't for himself. "Isabella, do not—" "I have to dig it out," she whispered, her hands shaking violently. "If I don't, you die. And if you die, I die. Hold still." She didn't give him a chance to argue. She pressed her free hand hard against his chest, holding him down, and guided the tip of the heated knife into the wound. Jacob arched off the floorboards, a guttural, inhuman shriek tearing from his throat. His hands turned into claws, gouging deep gashes into the wooden floor. The heat of the blade hissed against his black blood, filling the cabin with an atrocious stench. I know, I'm sorry," Isabella sobbed, tears streaming down her face as she dug deeper, feeling blindly with the tip of the knife. Her knuckles brushed against his frozen flesh. He was so cold, but his pain was agonizingly human. Clink. The knife tapped against something solid. She angled the blade, leveraging it beneath the slug, and pushed. With a sickening squelch, a mangled chunk of silver and lead popped out of the wound, clattering onto the floorboards. Isabella collapsed back, gasping for air, the bloody knife slipping from her fingers. Jacob lay perfectly still. He wasn't screaming anymore. "Jacob," she whispered, crawling back to him. The bullet was out, but the black veins weren't retreating. The ash was still in his system, choking his regenerative abilities. He was slipping away. "Jacob, please," she begged, grabbing his face. His skin was like marble. "Fresh." He barely breathed the word. Fresh blood. It was the only way a vampire could flush toxins and kickstart their healing. Isabella didn't hesitate. She picked up the combat knife, placed the sharp edge against the palm of her left hand, and sliced. The pain was sharp, but the bright crimson blood that welled up instantly was a stark contrast to his. She pressed her bleeding palm directly against his pale, parted lips. "Drink," she commanded. Jacob's eyes snapped open. The scent of her blood hit him, and the monster beneath the ice violently awoke. His fangs extended with a sharp click, his hands flying up to grip her wrists. His grip was suddenly terrifyingly strong. He was starving, poisoned, and desperate. He could drain her in seconds. For a terrifying heartbeat, Isabella thought she had made a fatal mistake. He stared at her palm, his eyes blazing a terrifying, luminous red. But then he looked past her hand, up into her tear-streaked eyes. The monster paused. With agonizing slowness, Jacob closed his eyes. He didn't bite her. He simply turned his head, pressing his lips to her palm, and began to drink. The sensation was overwhelming. It wasn't the sharp, agonizing bite she had feared. It was a slow, rhythmic pull, deeply intimate and terrifyingly gentle. Isabella knelt frozen on the floorboards, watching as the life literally drained from her and flowed into him. With every swallow Jacob took, the terrifying black webbing across his chest began to recede, dissolving back into pale, flawless skin. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She swayed, her vision blurring at the edges. Instantly, Jacob stopped. He pulled her hand away, his chest heaving as he drew in a deep, unnecessary breath. His eyes, now burning with their usual vibrant crimson, locked onto hers. The dullness was gone. The king was back. But he didn't let go of her hand. With alarming tenderness, he brought her bleeding palm to his mouth one last time, his tongue dragging gently over the cut. The wound stitched itself closed beneath his touch, leaving only a faint, silvery scar. He finally released her hand, sitting up slowly. The bullet wound in his side was already knitting together, the torn muscle repairing itself in real time. "You are a fool, Isabella," he said softly. The coldness was entirely gone from his voice. It was thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I kept you alive," she retorted, rubbing her dizzy head. She moved to sit closer to the wood stove, wrapping the mercenary's oversized parka tightly around herself. You gave a starving predator access to your veins, he corrected her, watching her intently. You risked everything. You risked everything pulling me out of that car, she countered, looking back at him. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows across his sharp features. You said you took me as a hostage, a political prop. But that's a lie, isn't it? Jacob went completely still. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the unspoken truth. The human enclaves were going to execute you, he finally said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. Your father was caught funneling weapons to the separatist factions. The council deemed your entire bloodline compromised. They were going to make an example of you. Isabella stared at him, the bottom dropping out of her stomach. What? I demanded you as part of the treaty, Jacob continued, his eyes never leaving hers. Under Night Court law, a royal ward cannot be touched by human tribunals. I didn't take you to threaten them. I took you to strip them of their jurisdiction. Tears pricked Isabella's eyes, the resentment, the anger she had carried for 3 months. It had all been built on a lie he had carefully maintained to protect her. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice cracking. Why let me hate you? Jacob stood up slowly, the grace returning to his movements. He walked over to her, kneeling in front of the wood stove so they were at eye level. Because if you hated me, you would stay away from me, he said, reaching out. His fingers, no longer freezing but possessing a strange, soothing coolness, brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. You are vibrant, Isabella. You are loud and angry and fiercely alive. You brought a light into my court that I haven't seen in centuries. If I had let you close, if I had let you see that I cared. He stopped, his jaw tightening. You would burn the world down to keep it, she finished softly, repeating his words from the forest. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The space between them vanished as Jacob leaned in, the emotional dam finally breaking. But before their lips could meet, a sharp burst of static shattered the silence. On the floor, inside the dead mercenary's backpack, the radio crackled to life. Echo 2, do you copy? We found Echo 4, throat crushed. We have fresh tracks leading north by northeast toward the logging camp, surrounding the perimeter now. Burn it to the ground. Jacob's eyes flashed, the tender vulnerability instantly evaporating into lethal, predatory focus. He stood up, pulling Isabella to her feet behind him. The hunt wasn't over. It had just arrived at their door. The first bullet tore through the rotting timber of the logging cabin before the radio's static even fully faded. It shattered a tin mug resting on a nearby crate, spraying Isabella with metallic shrapnel. Jacob moved faster than human thought. He grabbed her by the shoulders, hurling her toward the center of the room. Get behind the stove, he roared. Isabella hit the floorboards hard, scrambling frantically behind the rusted iron belly of the wood stove, just as the front wall of the cabin disintegrated under a barrage of heavy, suppressed gunfire. Bright blue streaks of UV-laced ammunition crisscrossed the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust and splintering wood like a deadly laser show. The sound was deafening. It wasn't the erratic fire of street thugs. This was a coordinated, militaristic suppression tactic. Stay perfectly flat, Jacob commanded. He wasn't hiding behind the iron stove with her. He was crouched in the deepest shadow, near the ruined doorway, his eyes burning like twin red suns. The blood she had given him had done more than heal his wounds. It had awakened the apex predator the world feared. Jacob, they have us pinned, Isabella shouted over the roar of shredding wood, clutching the dead mercenary's sidearm in her trembling hands. They think they have us pinned. A lull in the gunfire stretched for 2 heartbeat-skipping seconds. Outside, heavy boots crunched through the snow, fanning out in a semicircle around the structure. Clear the angles! Flashbangs out! A voice barked in the dark. Close your eyes! Jacob yelled. Isabella buried her face in her arms a fraction of a second before two metallic canisters shattered the window panes. The explosion was less of a sound and more of a concussive shock wave that rattled her teeth, followed by a light so intensely white it burned through her closed eyelids. Before the ringing in her ears could even begin, Jacob moved. He didn't retreat. He exploded forward, launching himself straight through the ruined front window into the blinding, smoke-filled void. Isabella risked peeking around the edge of the stove. The scene outside was pure chaos. Jacob was a shadow, moving through strobe lights. He slammed into the first mercenary with enough force to cave in the man's chest plate, using his momentum to hurl the dying man into two others. Guns fired wildly, blue lasers cutting indiscriminately through the trees as the highly trained assassins panicked. They were equipped to hunt a wounded, exhausted vampire. They were not prepared to fight the fully restored king of the Night Court. Jacob moved with lethal, devastating precision. He broke a wrist here, crushed a windpipe there, using the mercenaries' own sightlines against them to make them catch each other in the crossfire. But there were too many of them. From her vantage point, Isabella saw a sniper perched on a rocky outcropping 50 yards to the left, taking careful, steady aim with a heavy, tripod-mounted rifle directly at Jacob's back. Without thinking, Isabella raised her stolen sidearm, resting her wrist on the iron stove to steady her violently shaking hands. She didn't have thermal scopes or tactical training. She only had adrenaline and a desperate, blinding need to protect the man fighting for her life outside. She pulled the trigger. The heavy recoil bruised her palm, but she fired again, and again, emptying half the magazine toward the ridge. She didn't hit the sniper, but the shower of bark and sparks from the rock face beside him ruined his shot. His heavy UV round tore through the snowy earth 3 feet to Jacob's right. Jacob's head snapped toward the trajectory. He gave Isabella one brief, blazing look of acknowledgement before tearing a rifle from a fallen mercenary and returning fire up the ridge with terrifying accuracy. The sniper slumped over the rocks, dead. "Fall back!" the mercenary commander screamed over the comms. "He's at full strength! Initiate protocol, Inferno! Burn the structure!" The command sent a paralyzing spike of fear straight into Isabella's chest. 3 mercenaries near the tree line stopped firing. They slung their rifles over their shoulders and unholstered heavy, matte black grenade launchers. "Jacob!" Isabella screamed, abandoning her cover. Jacob dropped the rifle and sprinted back toward the cabin, just as the distinct, hollow thump of the launchers echoed through the woods. 3 canisters shattered through the roof and walls. They didn't explode with kinetic force. Instead, they burst open in violent, hissing geysers of white phosphorus and incendiary gel. The old, dry timber of the cabin didn't just catch fire, it instantly turned into a blast furnace. The temperature in the room skyrocketed from freezing to hundreds of degrees in seconds. The air itself seemed to ignite, stealing the oxygen from Isabella's lungs. Jacob crashed through the doorway, his charcoal suit smoking. He grabbed Isabella by the waist, throwing her to the floor as a beam above them collapsed in a shower of hellish orange sparks. "The front is a wall of fire!" he shouted over the roar of the flames, dragging her toward the back of the cabin. "There's no exit!" "We're going to burn alive!" she choked out, coughing as thick, black smoke filled the space. Her eyes streamed with tears, the heat searing the skin on her face. "I told you," Jacob growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, primal resonance. "I would burn the forest to ash before I let them touch you." He didn't look for a door. He looked down. The floorboards beneath them were rotting, weakened by moisture and time. Jacob raised his heavy boot and stomped downward with the force of a falling anvil. The wood splintered and caved, creating a jagged hole leading into the dark, freezing crawl space beneath the foundation. "Go!" he ordered, shoving her toward the opening. Isabella slid into the freezing mud and snow, just as the roof of the cabin began to cave in entirely. A massive slab of burning timber fell, heading straight for the hole. Jacob caught it with his bare hands. His skin hissed, the smell of burning flesh mingling with the pine smoke, but his face remained a mask of iron determination. With a primal roar, he hurled the burning timber aside and dropped into the dirt beside her. "Crawl!" he rasped, his hands blistered and smoking. "Toward the ridge, don't stop!" They belly-crawled through the freezing mud, the gap between the earth and the floorboards a mere 18 inches. Above them, the cabin was a roaring inferno. The heat radiating through the wood so intensely it felt like crawling under an active broiler. The mercenaries outside were firing indiscriminately into the flames. Assuming nothing could survive the heat, they reached the edge of the foundation, sliding out from under the back of the cabin, just as the entire structure collapsed onto itself in a geyser of sparks. They didn't look back. Covered in mud, soot, and blood, they scrambled up the steep, snow-covered embankment behind the cabin, slipping on the ice, but propelled by raw terror. They reached the top of the ridge, chest heaving, lungs burning. Isabella looked down at the blazing ruin below them. The mercenaries were circling the fire like vultures, unaware their prey had slipped through the dirt. But as Isabella turned to Jacob, a new, far more terrifying realization washed over her. The eastern horizon was bleeding a pale, slate grey. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed toward the sky. The sun, dawn, was the ultimate equalizer. No amount of strength, no amount of blood could protect a vampire from the ultraviolet radiation of direct sunlight. Jacob looked at the lightening sky, his crimson eyes narrowing. The dull, milky hue was beginning to creep back into his irises. His body, already exhausted from the silver poison, the fight and the fire, was reacting instinctively to the approaching dawn. He was weakening. "We need deep cover," he said, his voice tight. "A cave, a ravine. The canopy here is too thin." He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Isabella caught him, her own exhausted muscles screaming in protest as she threw his arm over her shoulder. She was still wearing the oversized, insulated mercenary parka. "I've got you," she grunted, bearing his weight. "Just keep moving." They staggered away from the burning ridge, moving deeper into the mountains. The grey sky slowly shifted to a bruised purple, then to a soft, warning pink. With every passing minute, Jacob grew heavier. His skin, normally pristine, was taking on an ashen, brittle quality. "They're tracking us," Jacob murmured, his head lolling slightly. "The smoke from my hands. They have thermal locks again." Isabella glanced over her shoulder. Below them, through the skeletal trees, she could see the sweeping beams of flashlights. The mercenaries had realized they weren't in the ashes. "Don't look back," she told him, pushing them both forward. "We're going to make it." Suddenly the trees broke. They stumbled out onto a wide, exposed plateau of flat rock. There was no cover, no caves, just an endless expanse of stone. And to their right, the rising sun preparing to crest the mountain peaks. Jacob collapsed, pulling Isabella down with him onto the freezing rock. He looked up at the sky, a quiet, resigned stillness settling over his features. "Isabella," he whispered, his hand reaching out to weakly grip hers. "Listen to me. When the sun breaches the peaks, the mercenaries will push. You put your hands up. You tell them you are a human hostage. They are mercenaries, not zealots. They get paid to kill me. They will leave you alive." "No," she sobbed, panic clawing at her throat. She frantically unzipped the massive white parka, pulling it off her shoulders. "I'm not leaving you. I am not letting you die." She threw the thick down jacket over him, covering his head and torso completely. Then she threw her own body over his, wrapping her arms around him to shield any exposed skin from the sky. "Isabella, stop!" Jacob commanded from beneath the coat, his voice muffled but desperate. You will be in the crossfire. Get off me! I burn the world down to keep it, she yelled back, crying openly now as the first golden rays of sunlight pierced the clouds, striking the plateau. Below them, the tree line rustled. 6 mercenaries stepped out onto the rock, their rifles raised, their thermal scopes fixed on the huddled mass of coats and human bodies. "Target acquired," the lead mercenary said, his voice cold and victorious. "Light him up." Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, holding on to the Vampire King, bracing for the volley of bullets, but the bullets never came. Instead, a sound like tearing canvas ripped through the dawn air. It was a massive, concussive thep-wop, the-wop, the-wop that vibrated deep in Isabella's chest. She opened her eyes just in time to see a massive, matte black V-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft rise menacingly from the gorge beneath the plateau, completely blocking out the rising sun. Its reinforced chassis was painted with the blood-red crest of the Night Court. The side doors of the aircraft were already open. 4 figures clad in heavy, sun-shielding tactical armor stood at the edge, holding heavy rotary cannons. They weren't mercenaries. They were the Royal Guard. Before the human assassins could even register the threat, the rotary cannons spun to life. A devastating, uninterrupted stream of high-caliber rounds shredded the tree line, instantly annihilating the mercenary squad in a cloud of dust, snow, and blood. The Osprey hovered over the plateau, a specialized UV-blocking ramp lowering onto the rock just feet from where Isabella lay. A tall figure in armored gear ran down the ramp, immediately unfurling a heavy, sun-proof canopy over Jacob and Isabella. "My king," the guard said, bowing his head deeply. "Forgive our delay. The separatist factions jammed our radar. Are you injured?" Jacob slowly pushed the Parker away, sitting up beneath the protective shadow of the canopy. The ashen weakness was still there, but his eyes were bright, filled with the absolute authority of a ruler whose throne had just been secured. "I am well, Marcus," Jacob said, his voice steady. He turned his gaze to Isabella, who was kneeling beside him, shivering, covered in dirt and blood, but staring at the aircraft in awe. Jacob didn't stand up immediately. Instead, he reached out, taking Isabella's trembling, blood-stained hand in his. In front of his royal guard, in front of the soldiers who had spent centuries seeing humans only as cattle or political pawns, the Vampire King brought her knuckles to his lips and pressed a slow, reverent kiss to her skin. "I am not a hostage anymore, am I?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "No," Jacob replied, his crimson eyes locking onto hers, burning with a warmth that rivaled the rising sun behind them. "You are my equal, and if the Enclaves or the Separatists want to touch you—" He stood up, pulling her to her feet, his arm wrapping securely around her waist as he guided her up the ramp of the waiting aircraft. "They will have to come through me," the heavy reinforced ramp of the Osprey sealed shut behind them, plunging the cabin into the dim, crimson glow of tactical lighting. The roar of the twin rotors was instantly muffled to a low, powerful hum by the heavily pressurized, sound-dampened interior. Isabella collapsed into one of the leather jump seats, her back hitting the bulkhead. The sudden cessation of violence, the abrupt leap from freezing death to absolute security, caused her adrenaline to crash catastrophically. She wrapped her arms around her knees, shivering so violently her teeth rattled against each other. Marcus, the towering commander of the Royal Guard who had pulled them from the plateau, approached her. He didn't carry the usual cold disdain the inner circle reserved for humans. Instead, he unlatched a heavy, heated thermal blanket from a wall compartment and draped it carefully over her trembling shoulders. "For the shock, Miss Isabella," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying a newfound resonance of profound respect. He didn't call her human. He didn't call her ward. Isabella clutched the blanket tightly, nodding her thanks as her eyes darted to the other side of the cabin. Jacob was seated opposite her. 2 field medics were attempting to assess the blistered, soot-stained flesh of his hands and the torn fabric covering his healed side. Jacob, however, ignored them completely. His intense, crimson gaze was fixed solely on Isabella, assessing every tremor in her shoulders, the ash streaked across her pale face, and the drying blood on her hands. "Attend to her," Jacob commanded the medics, his voice slicing through the low hum of the engines. It was the voice of the sovereign, cold, absolute, and entirely terrifying to anyone but her. "She is suffering from stage 2 hypothermia, sire, but you have sustained—" One medic began to protest, holding a syringe of dark synthetic blood. I said, "Attend to her!" Jacob snarled, the temperature in the cabin seemingly dropping 10 degrees. The medics instantly flinched away from him, rushing to Isabella's side with a diagnostic scanner and a heated IV drip. "Jacob, I'm fine," Isabella managed to say, her voice hoarse from inhaling smoke. "Let them help you. Your hands—" "My hands will heal," he replied, leaning his head back against the bulkhead and closing his eyes. The fatigue was finally catching up to him, the sun exposure leaving his skin paler than usual. "I have consumed enough of your blood to sustain the regeneration. I will not take another drop, synthetic or otherwise, until I know you are stable." The flight back to the Night Court estate took less than 40 minutes, but it felt like hours to Isabella. As the medics worked, wrapping her in heated coils and cleaning the minor cuts on her face, she watched Jacob. The icy, unfeeling king she had ridden with just hours ago was gone. In his place sat a man fiercely, terrifyingly protective of what was his. When the Osprey finally touched down on the private helipad of the Night Court, the estate was not asleep. The sprawling, Gothic modern fortress of black marble and glass was entirely illuminated against the early morning sky. The massive courtyard below the landing pad was filled with hundreds of the vampire elite, the inner circle, the court nobles, and most importantly, the faction leaders. They were waiting to see if their king was dead. The ramp lowered, the cold mountain air rushed in, but Jacob didn't shiver. He stood up, shrugging off the medics. He didn't bother to find a new coat. He stepped out in his ruined, blood-stained shirt, the damage of the night worn like a terrifying badge of honor. He didn't walk out alone. He reached back, his hand wrapping firmly around Isabella's. As they walked down the ramp side by side, a shocked, rippling murmur swept through the gathered aristocracy. They saw the blood on his clothes. They saw the burns on his hands. But above all, they saw the human girl walking beside him, not cowering, but held securely by the king himself. Lord Valerius, an ancient, silver-haired vampire known for his separatist sympathies, stood at the front of the crowd. He bowed stiffly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine panic. "My king," Valerius smoothly projected, his voice echoing off the marble. "We were horrified to hear of the ambush. Praise the night you have returned to us unscathed. We have already ordered a tribunal to investigate how the humans—" Jacob didn't break his stride. He moved with a sudden, violent speed that made Isabella gasp. He crossed the tarmac in a blur, his uninjured hand shooting out to clamp around Lord Valerius's throat. With a sickening display of supernatural strength, Jacob lifted the ancient aristocrat 2 feet off the ground, cutting off his words instantly. The courtyard erupted into gasps, the royal guard instantly raising their weapons to keep the surrounding nobles back. "You jammed my radar, Valerius," Jacob whispered, his voice low, vibrating with absolute lethal intent, yet loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. "Sire, Valerius choked, clawing at Jacob's iron grip. "You thought you could bury me in the snow," Jacob continued, his crimson eyes glowing with feral intensity. "You thought you could use the mercenaries to kill me and execute her. framing the enclaves to shatter the treaty. You underestimated my strength. But far worse. Jacob tightened his grip, the sound of bone straining echoing in the silence. He looked back over his shoulder at Isabella, who stood perfectly still on the ramp, watching the brutal display of power. You underestimated hers. Jacob looked back to the choking lord. She saved my life tonight. She bled for me. The next time anyone in this court looks at her, they will not see a hostage. They will see the reason your king still stands. With a flick of his wrist, Jacob hurled Lord Valerius onto the cold marble. The ancient vampire skidded across the ground, coughing violently. "Lock him in the solar cells," Jacob commanded the guards, not sparing the traitor another glance, "and round up his entire syndicate. Burn them all." He turned his back on the terrified court and walked back to Isabella. The terrifying predator vanished the moment he reached her, replaced by a steady, grounding presence. He offered her his arm, ignoring the hundreds of staring eyes. "Come," he said softly, leading her past the stunned nobles and toward the heavy oak doors of the palace. "Let us go home." 2 days later, the shift in power was absolute. Isabella stood on the grand balcony of Jacob's private quarters. Below her, the courtyard was quiet, the ashes of the separatist coup having already settled. She wasn't wearing silk hostage attire anymore. She was dressed in a structured midnight blue gown, a silver chain resting delicately against her collarbone, bearing the royal crest. The heavy doors behind her opened silently. Jacob stepped out onto the balcony, the shadows of the room bending slightly to accommodate him. He was fully healed, immaculate once more in a tailored suit. But the icy, impenetrable aura that used to suffocate the room was gone when he looked at her. He moved to her side, resting his hand casually on the stone balustrade right next to hers. "The tribunal execution orders against your family have been permanently revoked," Jacob said softly, his voice carrying only to her ears. "The enclaves have conceded. They realized that attacking what is mine brings absolute ruin." "And what am I to them now?" Isabella asked, looking up at his sharp profile. "If I'm not a hostage, and I'm not a political prop?" Jacob turned his head, his crimson eyes locking onto hers with a possessive, consuming intensity. He reached out, his cool fingers gently tracing the faint, fading scar on her palm, where she had sliced it to save his life. "You are the woman who bled for a monster," he murmured, leaning in until his lips were mere inches from hers. "You are the warmth that conquered the ice. To them, you are untouchable." He closed the final distance, kissing her, not with the desperate, starving need from the cabin, but with a deep, deliberate reverence that sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. It was a promise forged in fire and blood. When he finally pulled back, he looked out over his court, his arm sliding firmly around her waist to pull her flush against his side. "To them," the vampire king declared, his voice echoing with absolute finality over the frozen estate. "You are the queen. Sometimes the people we perceive as the coldest are merely those who have the most to lose by showing their warmth." In the frozen expanse of the mountain, Isabella and Jacob learned that vulnerability isn't a weakness. It is the truest armor we can forge when everything else burns away. Their harrowing survival wasn't just an escape from assassins. It was an escape from the walls they had built around themselves, culminating in a powerful alliance that would reshape their world. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of survival, shifting alliances, and deep romance. If this dramatic, high-stakes story kept you on the edge of your seat, please like, share, and subscribe.